Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys for stopping by very much. So I have the round 2, game 4 between Magnus Carlsen, world champion, and world Fisher Random 960 world champion Wesley. So as you guys know, they did get paired in the quarterfinals of the Goldmoney Asian Rapid. So this is one of their games. And what I can say about these two guys' matchup is it's a true match of in-game, like, aficionados. Like what I noticed in the last game that I did, one of the other games that I did between them, there is just like a whole gigantic amount of in-game maneuvering and techniques and stuff like that. So there's just a wealth of stuff that's occurring in these games to talk about. And this game is no different. There are a lot of in-game concepts that come up in this particular game. And so we're going to kind of test and see, what people know out there in-game wise. There's a few concepts that I'll be mentioning that, some people, if they want to do some research, in games generally are, a little bit more boring than the, the rich opening and middle game, stuff like that. But one simple move can make or break your position. And so, for all my people in the Philippines, mabuhay, kamusta na? Masaya Kong Makiti Kang Muli, appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. For anybody who is coming from Norway, I will say God Morgan to you and Tusen Tak. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by very much. And anybody else from around the world, I really appreciate you guys watching my stuff and interacting with me and everything. And I definitely appreciate the support. So if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got D4. Let me get this volume hooked up. Sometimes I forget. Bam. All right, so we got D4, knight comes to F6. We see knight to F3. We have D5, C4. So, I mean, you guys that watch my stuff, I mean, this is a very familiar position to you. We see E6, so you have Slavs, Catalans, all different types of stuff that could come from this. So we do see knight to C3 and we see pawn takes C4. So we have the Queen's Gambit declined, the 3 knights Vienna variation. Pretty much, because we took this pawn here. Like I said a couple of videos ago, if we do have D4, D5, and then C4 pawn takes, we would have the Queen's Gambit accepted. So there's not like a crazy amount of differences between the positions. But, we've gotten into the opening a little bit more. So we see E3, we have A6. A6 is pretty clear. Like, as black, when you do take on C4, especially when you have Slav type situations, if you can achieve A6, C6, B5, and then bishop to B7, you literally just won a pawn. That's basically what it boils down to, because everything is protected. The problem that black actually has trying to hold on to the pawn is that they have to make so many moves that don't really do anything for their development just to hold on to the pawn. So if you allow black to achieve that, then you're just down a pawn. So we do see A4. We don't want to see any of the B5 stuff. So we see B6. Bishop takes C4, which is pretty common. That's why usually people will wait, before they take on C4 to try to, inconvenience white a little bit. We do see bishop to B7. We got castles. Bishop coming to B4. We see queen over to E2. Of course, we're not worried about a trades here because they're just going to get a whole bunch of pawns in the center, which is good. We got castles. We see rook to D1. We see queen down to E7. Even though it's not absolutely necessary, it's always usually a good idea to move your queen off of the same line as a rook, because, sometimes there can be some tactics that'll come up and, kind of mess you up a little bit. So we see bishop back to D3. We see C5. You knew it was coming. You guys were like, yeah, C5. It came. Exactly. Good job. So we see knight to A2. We got knight over to C6. Knight takes B4. Knight takes B4. We see the novelty of the game now, which is B3. It's pretty clear. I mean, we're trying to put our bishop on, one of these two diagonals at some point. So after we see knight takes D3, rook takes D3, bishop to E4, which, I mean, isn't that bad of an inconvenience. We're just going to move the rook. Rook F to C8. We do see bishop to A3. So, we decided to go ahead and put the bishop on this diagonal. So we're adding a little bit of pressure. We're pinning this pawn here. So, the queen now has to, it's usually, you have situations where, you have bishops or you have rooks opposite your queen, so you're constantly kind of having to move it around. So that's what we see. We see queen going to B7, which is kind of adding a little bit of pressure onto this knight here on F3, because, we do have a chance now to maybe possibly damage white structure some. So we see pawn takes C5, pawn takes C5, then we see rook D to C1. We've managed to create, something in the position. So the queen does take on b3. We see bishop taking c5. We see knight back to d7. We have bishop to d4. Rook takes c1. Rook takes c1. Queen takes a4. We see knight up to e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. And then we do have bishop to d5. And in this actual position, black is just really up a clear pawn. There's not any type of tactical anything that's going on in this position. So because of all of the trades and all of, the combinations and stuff that we just saw a second ago, black is just a clear pawn up. So white doesn't have any compensation for that pawn. So it's just how that ended up working out. So we do see f3. We see f6, because why not attack the bishop? It's beautifully placed in the center of the board. So, let's try to get rid of it. So we do see bishop to d6. We see rook over to d8. And then we're being a little bit sneaky with white. We got queen to b2. Now, queen to b2, clearly you're not going to take the bishop on d6 because you're going to be sad after you look at queen to b8 with check. Placing a double attack on the rook and on the king. So don't do that. So after queen to b2, we do try to block that possibility with bishop to b3. And then we actually see queen to a3. And queen to a3 is one of those situations where, this is actually what black does want. Because they are up material, so, they do want to trade. So for whatever reason, Wesley just says, hey, I don't want the trade, let me decline it. But if you actually do go into the trade, you would see queen taking a3, bishop taking a3, and then you would be seeing a5. And you guys can see, you have a pass pawn, and it is an outside pass pawn. And for those of you that are familiar with in-games or just play in general, when you have a pass pawn, it's beneficial. But when you have an outside pass pawn, when you have reduced the material, are a lot harder for kings to try to hold, defend against as an outside pass pawn. So those are much more coveted than the regular general pass pawn. So like I said, we did see queen to b5. We see h3. We got e5 rolling. We see rook over to b1. And this actually is kind of a little bit of a problem because, your queen, the bishop is pinned to your queen. So we do see queen to d3. We see queen takes b3 with check. We see queen takes b3, rook takes b3, rook takes d6. And like I said, you're just in an endgame where you're up a pawn, which, in a rook endgame, it's not the end of the world. But like I said before, there are a lot of things at play in this particular position. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So we do see rook to b7. And we got h5. So, rook to b7 is logical. Like I said, black is up about a point. Literally they're up a pawn. So, rook to b7 is probably one of the best things you could play, just trying to restrict the king, so it's usually useful. So we got h4, rook comes to d3, we see e4. And so, this is a kind of a situation where black can get themselves into a position where they can start kind of attacking you, on these back two files. And so making it a little bit inconvenient for white. So we got a5, pass pawns must be pushed. So that's one of the most logical things to do in the situation. Rook to a7, trying to attack the pawn, and we see rook to a3. And I'll be explaining something that is in this position coming up pretty soon. So we see king coming to f2. We see a4. We have rook to a8 with check. Pushes the king down to f7. We see rook to a7 with check, and then now we have the king creeping into g6. We see king to g3. We see rook to a2, because we're not trying to allow the king to move himself up, with something like maybe, let's say, f4 and then trades and stuff like that. So we do see king to h3, just maintaining connection with your pawn. So we see rook to a1. We see g3. Rook comes to a2. We see f4. a3. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. We see g4. We got rook down to a1. We see g5, and then we see a2 by black. Now, before I go into the concepts that are starting to become present in this type of an endgame, if you want to go ahead and stop the video right now and guess, there are two moves that are literally only moves that white can make in this position. And I'll be explaining to you exactly why that is. But like I said, if you want to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can guess these two only moves for white, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So before I get into the actual moves, I'm going to explain to you exactly why these moves are relevant. Why they're pretty much only moves. Because it kind of seems like you have a bunch of moves in the position, right? But you don't actually. The thing that you have to think about when you get into an end game where you have this particular type of a setup, where, you know, ideally you want to get your rook behind a passed pawn to basically, you know, render your opponent's rook immobile. When you're in this type of a situation where you actually find yourself behind, like in front of your own pawn, and you are on the 7th rank and the opponent's rook is behind your rook, the opponent is in a situation where he has to play specific king moves. So if you guessed either king to g2 or king to h2, then you would be correct. Those are the moves as white you have to make, because if not, you are losing the game if you literally make any other type of a move. So the situation is where you want to move this rook away from this pawn because you want to clear the queening square. But the problem is, if you don't move it with a tempo or just move it with some type of a threat, you're literally just going to be hanging your pawn. So the two things that you have to think about is you have to either threaten to check the opponent's king and then push your pawn to queen, or you have to set up a situation where you're going to be able to place a threat on the king and pick up the rook on the other side. So I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about with those two things. If the king moves, let's say, for example, the king, you know, it seems like it might be something similar. Let's say the king goes to g3, right? This would actually be completely lost because now you can move the rook out of the way of the queening square and check the king. And it doesn't matter what this king does when it comes to try to attack your, you know, say you do something like this, you have the ability to queen. And now you're in a situation where you just queened your piece. And you are threatening this piece. And so now the rook has to take. And now you're just down a complete rook. So whether you make sure that you keep yourself on the 2nd rank, or you make sure that you have some type of pawn cover that you can hide behind, those are the only right things in this particular position. Also, going forward in the position that we actually saw in the game, king comes to g2, we see king back to h7, we see king to h2. Now, if you notice, coming up in the position, the king basically just shifts back and forth because of what I just said. The king comes back to g2 or g6. Now we see king to g2. We see rook to e1 coming in this particular position. But before we go any further, let me go back. If after king to g2, we see king to h7, let's say, you know, you weren't aware of this particular situation and you actually went to king to f2. Just, you know, kind of thinking like, man, that seems pretty similar. This would actually be completely dead lost as well. And it is because of the two threats that I mentioned earlier. Now the rook has the ability to swing to h1. And now you do not have the ability to take this pawn because you're going to be looking at rook to h2 with check. So the king is forced to have to try to, you know, maybe go back. But then now you can queen in a similar type of a fashion. So this is like some really deep in-game stuff. But it kind of gives you an understanding of like why people are making these seemingly maybe stupid moves. Like, why is he just going back and forth? That's exactly why. So, like I said, these end games that we're getting into with Magnus Carlsen versus Wesley, so there's like a wealth of situations coming up. And that's not it. So if we just continue to go forward from what we saw in the game, king came to g2, we see rook to e1. There is a specific way that you have to do this as white to try to hold the position that we see right here. So after rook to a6, you would see king coming back to f7. And this is where Magnus Carlsen actually prematurely grabs this pawn on a2. There was a certain way, there was a certain, like, you know, continuation that you had to actually go into to pretty much make things be fairly even by threatening a draw. So he takes rook to a2 at this particular point here. But if we back up, what you need to play in this position is actually g6, checking the king. And then this actually either forces a draw or it forces at least equality, like enough to where you're not actually losing the game. So after king to f8, you literally just start checking. So not naming moves, just literally showing you what happens. And then if the king starts to go too far away and he gets to c5, you now can take the pawn. And then after rook takes e4, you can go back. And then now you are able to take this pawn on g7. So after rook takes h4, rook takes g7, rook to g4, king comes to f3. You know, as you guys can see, you know, white now has the same idea that black had a little bit earlier with that pawn. So it's a little bit more competitive. So like after rook takes a2, we see rook takes e4. We got king to h3. We have a rook to d4. Rook comes to a7 with check. King comes to g6. We have rook to e7. And then we have rook to e4. And as you guys can see, it's about recognizing patterns. Like when you get into certain, you know, when you start studying chess more and more, you start recognizing patterns. If you guys are thinking what, I mean, if you guys are looking at the position, this position looks very similar to what we saw before, where you had the rook behind the pawn, and you have the rook in front of the pawn. So it's like we pretty much just duplicated the position. We're just in a different part of the board. So you start to recognize these types of patterns that come up in these types of positions. So we see king to g3. Rook comes to g4 with check. We got king to h3. We see e4. So now the pawn's starting to push. We see rook to a7. Rook comes to f4. We see rook to e7. We see rook to g4. Rook to a7. Rook comes to king comes to f5. And this is a crucial point that we're getting to in the game here. Rook takes on g7. We see e3. We have rook to f7 with check. We see king to e4. We see rook to e7. We see king down to d3. We see rook to d7 with check. King comes to c2. We see rook to e7. King comes to d2. We see rook to d7 with check. King comes to e1. We see rook to h7. We see king to f2. We see rook to f7 with check. We see king down to e1. Rook comes to e7. We see e2. We see rook takes h5, now undermining the protection of this rook. And then we see rook to e4. Rook to e4. We see g6. King comes to d2. Now we're threatening to queen our pawn immediately, and that's going to be mating coming up. We see rook to d3. Rook to d5 with check. King comes to e3. Now, this particular position that you see on the board now is something very similar, almost identical to, like, there's two positions that you want to know as far as rook endgames are concerned. It's the Philidor position and the Lucena position. What you're looking at right now is what is basically called building a bridge. And it is part of the Lucena position, which is pretty much like the key to all rook endgames, right? So if you're not familiar with the Lucena position, go ahead and go to Wikipedia and look that up. Lucena, Lucena. You can also pretty much find it in any like endgame book that you pick up for the most part. You know, any Yasser Seirawan or Jeremy Silman, Mark Dvorsky, they're all going to talk about this Lucena position. John Bartholomew actually has some stuff on it as well. I haven't covered it myself, but like I said, usually you see the king and the rook shifted one square, but this is still building a bridge because you're basically building a block. So that way you are shielding yourself from checks and you are threatening immediately to promote your pawn. And it's on the 7th rank. So, yeah, as you guys know, you know, end games are pretty deep. You know, there's a lot to end games, man. So, for you to be a great end game player, it's no small feat. But this is the position that Magnus Carlsen resigned because, you know, like I said, he's a great end game player. And so he sees that there's no way to win this, even having an extra pawn as white. So he does resign the game. And for all of my people in the Philippines, get these good mornings. So maayong buntag, naibag na bigat, masantos ya kabason, marhe na aga, buenos dias, maayong aga, mapia na uma, kapian kapo no dios, mayat abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapapita, my big abukla, marajad na buntag, maria mainat, kasan yangan si LOB, assalamu alaikum, salam to you, merci beaucoup. Appreciate you guys very much. And like I said before, you know, you don't have to watch the entire video. I chapter my videos, but I mean, there's certain concepts and things that you have to explain fully. So you have to go a little bit longer to do it justice. So I'll get back to my short videos at some point, maybe. I don't know. But I appreciate you guys very much, and I'll see y'all next time.